Okay, welcome to the second OLM for this chapter. This is the object manipulation skills. The rest of them, essentially, we covered primarily the throwing skills in part 1, and we will discover part 2 today, all the other skills. Okay, let's start with catching, and unlike throwing, which has been researched like crazy, there's lots of evidence to talk about it, and throwing, of course, we know is the most complex of the object manipulation skills. Catching is been highly under-researched. Essentially, it's the action of bringing an airborne object under control by using the hands and the arms, and we see a simple depiction of that here. One of the fun things about being a new parent is when you get to kind of get down onto the floor and play with the kids, and one of the things you end up doing at some point when kids are able to sit up is start rolling a ball towards them. They sit with their legs open, you roll the ball towards them, you're sitting yourself likely in the same position, and yeah, you just slowly roll the ball towards them, and they get a great kick out of being able to trap the ball. The legs spread apart allows for the ball to sort of like a bumper to roll into their midsection so they can reach out and handle the ball with one hand or two. Early attempts at catching an airborne object rather than one that's being rolled are pretty passive. That means that the child stands facing the tosser and then attempts to project the ball into the child's outstretched arm. So you see kids basically with their arms out like a breadbasket, and the thrower will drop the ball into their arms so the child can trap the ball against their body. In this situation, the palms of the hands are often upward, and the child really doesn't make any attempt at all to adjust their body or arms to the oncoming ball. It's more pleasure for the thrower, the parent, the adult who is throwing the ball. And again, it's not even really a throw; it's kind of like a dropping it in, and then they get lots of happiness when they catch it, and then they get to obviously throw it back. This table gives us a little bit of an idea of what the different sequences are in terms of learning to catch. The static nature of the 2-year-old catching the ball I described earlier, but in this particular case, the person that's catching the ball, the toddler, is not really looking at the object at all. They're just so excited to be playing with somebody else. Again, typically a parent or adult on their knees, tossing something like a beanbag or some spongy soft ball into the arms. That they're because they're not paying attention to the ball, they often react too late, and it's just it's just early attempts to start to see some hand-eye coordination developing. As the child gets to around kindergarten age, they can start to anticipate the ball's flight a little bit better, and they start to shift their focus away from the thrower and more onto the ball. Now, they're still concerned and they're still excited about the thrower. They still are distracted by the thrower, but they are able to start working their hands in conjunction with the flight of the ball, and still pay attention to the thrower. So getting a little bit more comfortable at starting to catch, but not consistently. Typically, the movements in this kind of catch are slow, not developed, but they are starting to resemble what looks like a mature level of catching, but in a slow motion. And then by the time you're at the teenage years and mature, proficient throwing is evident, we can see that individuals are able to predict the ball's flight path. They're able to know where that ball is going to be. They'll actually move their body to get there. They move their feet, which is one of the biggest problems with people catching, is they forget that they're supposed to move their feet in order to get themselves into a position to carry out the catch properly. Here we see the movements in the mature catching being rather smooth and efficient. This is an example of what it looks like when a child is learning to catch. Remember, we talked about having their arms are stretched out. Here, there's still a relatively a healthy, well, maybe unhealthy, fear of the object that's being thrown. They are actually afraid that the ball is going to hit them in the face. They don't have the confidence to outright catch it. And this looks like to me maybe a preschool or a kindergarten age child. They're trying to catch with their hands without the use of their arms, but they haven't got quite the competence. And one of the most important elements of learning to catch is that you need to keep your eye on the ball, which is maybe a bit of a cliche, but it's true. When you're learning to catch, being able to track the object into the hands is probably the most important part of the hand-eye coordination experience. All right, looking at a little bit more carefully the sequences. two-hand catching, we see in this particular example that the child is presenting their arms directly in front of them, and the elbows are extended and the palms are facing upward, as we described early on in the toddler style catching. And they may be facing inward as well to the mid-sagittal plane. And then as the ball contacts the hands or arms, the elbows are flexed, and the arms and hands attempt to secure the ball by holding it against the chest. In other words, they're attempting here early stages of trying to trap the ball, which we'll see a little bit later on as kids develop to the next stage. Stage 2 catching is where the child is preparing to receive the objects with the arm in front of the body. Elbows are extended or maybe slightly fixed. But upon presentation of the ball, the arms begin an encircling motion that culminates by securing the ball against the chest. This is the classic catching trap that we see. Stage 2 also differs from the first stage in that the receiver initiates the arm action prior to the ball-arm contact in stage 2. Here in the third stage, we see the child preparing to receive the ball again with the arms that are slightly flexed and extended forward at the shoulder. Many children also receive the ball with arms that are flexed at the elbow, with the elbow ahead of the frontal plane. We also see here a couple of options for the catching of stage 3. In substage number 1, the child uses their chest first as the first point of contact. So they actually use it a bit like a backboard to bounce the ball off and then attempt to secure the ball by holding it to the chest with the arms and hands. Later on in substage 2, the child attempts to catch the ball with just their hands, but upon failure to hold it securely, maneuvers it to the chest where it's controlled by the hands and the arms. So again, the first one is expecting to use it to backboard the chest as a backboard. The second one uses it as an alternative method of gathering the ball in. Stage 4 is starting to look like a mature catching style, in that the child is preparing to receive the ball by flexing the elbows and presenting the arms ahead of the frontal plane. A skillful catcher in this case may keep the elbows at the sides and flex the arms simultaneously as they bring them forward to meet the ball. The ball is caught with the hands without making contact with any of the other body parts. Really, the big difference between this stage and the mature stage, which we'll see next, is the fact that they're still fairly static and they're really using their body in a fixed setting rather than moving their feet to intercept the ball. They're expecting the ball in this case to come to them. In this diagram, we see the mature style of catching. We see the feet adjusting to intercept the tracking of the ball. The arms are outstretched and meeting the ball, elbows flexed to absorb the impact of the catch. All the aspects that we would expect to see in a stage 4, plus the ability to move from their stationary base. Stage 5 is included because of the apparent difficulty that many children encounter when they are required to move in relation to an approaching object. So again, the clear distinction is movement or not. You'll also notice in this slide too that we see the differences, which are fairly subtle between boys and girls in their ability to learn to catch. Unlike the throwing object control skill, catching is rather similar, and by about 80 months, 60% of the kids are able to catch the ball, male or female. Compared to the evidence with two-handed catching, the scientific evidence regarding one-handed catching is really scarce. One of the things that become evident, though, as we look over the motor development of catching in boys and girls, is that boys are typically outperforming girls in this particular skill. Ball location is a factor. In other words, young children can orient their hands in all directions for a catch, but have troubles when they're doing that in closing their fingers around the ball. One-handed catching is certainly less successful than two-handed catching, and just think about that in terms of the activities that you do. When you're catching with two hands, you've got much more ability to stabilize the projectile, whereas with one, it's all about timing and the ability to squeeze the object to hold it in place against nothing else but in the fingers that you're wrapping around with. This is a list of some of the constraints that are associated with development of catching. So you can copy these down if you feel like it, but we're going to cover each one of them in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. Okay, so the first factor we'll take a look at is the ball size. Here, if you remember, we've talked about two different types of assessment. So let's think about research related to catching and specifically focusing on the constraint of the size of the ball. In product-oriented evaluations, we see that larger balls improve a young children's ability to catch. But in product, you'll recall, we're not really concerned about the technique and what level of maturation or stage they're at with regard to their catching technique. When we're evaluating the qualitative aspects of catching or the technique, it's often noted that smaller balls are more conducive to catching. And think about that sometimes. If somebody throws you a tennis ball versus maybe a little bit bigger ball, there are times because you've developed a fairly strong proficiency at being able to catch, you might actually agree that catching a tennis ball is a little bit easier than catching a bigger ball because of the ability to wrap your fingers around the width of the ball. And again, that's one of the constraints, ball size. Anybody that's ever played badminton knows about the impact of the shuttle color. We used to use a lot of white shuttles when playing badminton, and against a white background or the ceiling or lights, you'd often lose it in the background. And that's what this factor is all about, is the use of different colored balls result in a higher level of catching ability than just using a plain white ball, because again, the white ball gets often lost in the background, whether it's the sky or the background of the gym wall that is being thrown in front of. So blue balls against a white background, so we're looking at the color of maybe like a racquetball blue, elicit the highest level of success. So it's no surprise that in gyms, elementary school phys ed classes, we often see multicolored balls, but always it appears that they are deep red, deep blue, black. Not very often do we see white balls being used to teach young kids how to catch. Now, another story regarding background color, if you haven't noticed, in Major League Baseball, we always, if you've ever been to a game, right behind the pitcher and out in the center field is a completely dark space. Most often a blue, but maybe dark green or black wall. There's no seating, there's no cameras, there's no waterfalls or any other ivy or any other decoration directly behind the pitcher in line with the catcher. As the ball is being pitched, the hitter, which has only a few instantaneous moments, a split second, to be able to react to the trajectory and the speed of the ball, is given a bit of an assist by having a completely solid dark background behind them. So when you're the batter, you're looking through the pitcher at the background behind the pitcher, it's completely solid, usually a dark color, and that's because of the impact on catching, and in this particular case, in the example I've given you, the impact of striking on the background color. The speed of the ball is a factor in the success of being able to catch. Basically, as the speed of the ball increases, the catching performance decreases. It's important for kids to be able to find an optimal speed of the ball in order to be able to project what the angle or the ball path is going to be. So for some of you that are proficient throwers, you would actually probably prefer a flatter, harder throw that comes with very little angle or trajectory and a little bit faster. But for novice and developing catchers, having a slow projectile allows the eyes to track the ball and the brain to process the ability of when that ball is going to arrive at the hands. And so ball velocity, as you can imagine, is certainly a factor in catching. So on average, the optimal trajectory is about a 45-degree angle of a toss up, and then it reaches its apex and comes down at about the same angle, 45 degrees. This is what often elicits the best catches in novice and developing catchers. However, when kids are very young and they're toddlers, the flat pass is often most successful because, again, they're not looking up, but they're able to track the ball by just looking straight ahead, and you basically are tossing a soft projectile straight at them in their angle of their vision. So we don't have and if you want to make it really hard, you throw it really high and watch them have to track the ball all the way back down, and that's a very difficult skill for unskilled catchers to be able to do. So again, another constraint is the trajectory angle. You can start to see a little bit about how some of these factors are connected, because we're talking about the amount of time a child has to track the ball. And so this is a constraint in its own right, in that the amount of time they have to analyze the ball's pathway. So a slow-moving ball through space is preferred in inexperienced catchers because they've got time to process it. And again, as I mentioned before, some of you that have mature abilities to catch ball will be able to track a ball much easier at a faster trajectory. There's less margin of error, it seems like, as the catcher becomes more proficient and the ball increases in speed. So strategies that we use are to use like a wiffle ball that slows naturally the speed of its pathway in the air. And beach balls obviously are big, and they do the similar type of thing. Greater resistance in the air slows the ball down, more time for the child to be able to track and catch the ball. So from a teaching perspective, this is a fundamentally important factor, in that we know that instruction, according to the research that's been done in this area, has shown that it can help improve catching ability, because again, knowledge of how to position your hands, move your feet to the ball, how to track a ball, how to look the ball into the hands. I had a very successful football coach at the University of Calgary back when I was going to school there remind us during our football class that I took to watch the ball into your arms, and then he actually had us tap the end of the football as we brought it into the arms, just as a visual or physical kinesthetic sort of cue that we are keeping our eye on the ball all the way into the arms. So instruction and knowledge about how to catch is another important factor. Catching on run involves adjustments of not only the hands and the arms, but also the entire body when the ball is projected away from the child. Understandably, balls projected directly towards the child are easier to catch than those requiring the child to move to a new location to catch or intercept the ball. So it's important for teachers, when you're pairing up throwing and catching partners, to ensure that you have an inexperienced thrower with an inexperienced, to avoid having an inexperienced thrower with an inexperienced catcher. We want to have somebody that knows how to throw with a fairly good degree of proficiency, whether it's an underhand throw or an overhand throw, so that the child that's learning to catch has a fairly good chance of being able to learn to catch without having to move their feet. So the inexperienced thrower's inability to throw the ball directly at an inexperienced catcher will definitely increase the difficulty of the task. Again, if you can't get the ball to the target, then how is that person expected to be able to catch it when they're still just figuring out how to catch, never mind having to catch on the run? So again, another constraint in the ability to develop the catching skills. So using a glove like in baseball changes a lot of different things. Initially, it's very difficult for kids, especially because they don't have the forearm strength to be able to close the mitt, the glove around the ball. We often see balls bouncing, going into the glove. They've managed to time it successfully into the glove, but actually aren't able to secure it as easily as they would have maybe with their hand and fingers. So it does change a lot of things. It changes the distance of the end of your hand, because your glove is farther from your end of your fingers. So it just changes the actual position of the relative position of the catching area in your brain. So your brain takes some time to adjust to that. And again, initially it's a little bit more difficult, but eventually, because of the increased surface area, that actually helps eventually in catching. Of course, some of you couldn't imagine not catching a fastball or a hard ball without a glove, because it's just from a pain threshold perspective, it takes out some of the sting of a ball that's coming at high speeds. So glove catching is typically easier as a ball moves towards a larger target and it's caught over a larger surface area. But again, you've got to learn to be able to squeeze that glove closed in order to be able to keep that ball in that area. So let's talk about striking now, and it's basically another movement skill in which a designated body part or some kind of implement is used to project an object. In this particular case, propulsion skills are necessary to develop because many sports use this skill, whether it's a baseball or a badminton racket hitting a shuttle. The striking patterns in developing motor skills can be from an underhand position or from an overhand position. Spiking a volleyball or serving overhand and serving underhand in volleyball are examples again. When we add implements, in this picture we got some crazy bouncing implements that the kids are using, but it could be a racket, it could be a cricket bat. Again, there are levels of complexity that have to be overcome because the brain is processing new extensions of their body. You're not just striking with the hands. You're striking with an object that extends the reach of the body. A child's initial attempt at striking an object with either a bare hand or some other implement is very similar to the overarm throwing pattern young children exhibit. Briefly, at an inexperienced level of development, a child uses an overarm pattern that is predominantly flexion and extension of the forearm. The child usually directly faces the object rather than turning to 90 degrees to the object in order to strike it, and may or may not take a step forward. If the child does take a step forward, it is with the homolateral leg, in other words, the leg on the same side of the body as the striking arm. Thus, all the striking movements are accomplished on the anterior-posterior plane. The child's upward-downward swing pattern gradually flattens out, and flattening out the swing facilitates the child's ability to contact the ball. In most instances, this sidearm striking pattern becomes well defined by approximately 36 months. The cartoon figure here reminds me to remind you to take a look at some of the simple little animations I put up about striking, and there's some about catching and videos that support the OLM. You'll find those in the folder, likely underneath the OLM where you logged into to see this lecture. Some of the characteristics of the inexperienced striker that we've talked about already are that there is no step or steps taken with either leg pertaining to the transfer of weight with respect to being able to make contact with the associated implement. So, in other words, we're just stationary or static when an inexperienced child is striking an object. It's typically indicative as in an up-down striking motion with very little backswing. There's no rotation of the trunk or hips, and you've got very rigid arms. It's not a very smooth and fluid motion when you're learning to strike at the very early stages. Whether that's one-handed striking, such as in badminton, tennis, squash, other one-handed implements, or two-handed like cricket or baseball or otherwise.
1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out.
Experienced strikers, on the contrary, and you'll see this in this little 7-second animation that's in your folder, take a step forward with the opposite foot to transfer the weight forward and in the direction that you're trying to project the power from your body into the object that you're striking. You'll see a full backswing. The swing location is typically horizontal rather than being up and down. It's not like you're chopping at something like you're using an axe like an inexperienced striker would. This is very smooth and fluid, and in fact the bat will come through at exactly the same plane throughout the rotation of the hips and the trunk. And the follow through, the final ability biomechanically to complete the strike from an experienced perspective is the snap of the wrist. Here we see an example of the two-handed striking action, and there's that chopping motion I was talking about before, where it's primarily in the posterior anterior direction. The movement begins with a sort of hip extension and slight spinal extension, and then the retraction of the shoulder on the striking side of the body. Elbows flex fully, and the feet remain perfectly stationary throughout the movement, with the primary force coming from the extension of the flexed joints. You'll notice I put the small little insert at the top of this slide just to remind our education students, or those of you that it's been a while since you've taken anatomy, where the different body planes are. You'll hear me referring to the frontal plane, the coronal plane, transverse, sagittal planes. And so here in stage 2, we still see the feet remain pretty stationary, and however, there's a bit of a weight shifting going on as they move towards the approaching ball. The primary pattern, however, is the unitary rotation of the hip spinal linkage, and it's moving about an imaginary vertical axis. The forward movement of the bat is in a transverse plane in this particular case. So we're starting to see some of that smoothing and flattening out of the implement as it goes from back to front. In the third stage, we see the shift of weight to the front supporting foot occurring in an ipsilateral pattern. The trunk rotation, derotation is decreased markedly in comparison with stage 2, and the movements of the bat are in an oblique vertical plane instead of the transverse path that we saw in stage 2. In this mature example of striking, we see the transfer of weight in rotation, derotation is in the contralateral pattern. The shift of the weight to the forward foot occurs while the bat is moving backward as the hip, spine, and the shoulder girdle assume their force-producing positions. At the initiation of the forward movement, the bat is kept near the body. Elbow extension and the supination, pronation of the hands do not occur until the arms and hands are well forward and ready to extend the lever in preparation to meet the ball. At contact, the weight is on the forward foot, and we see an efficient follow-through. Again, similar patterns in terms of development. The girls develop much later through the second stage, but catch up a bit on the third stage. And there's perhaps maybe only a year and a half difference between the ability for boys and girls to strike at this mature level. Again, no difference physiologically, but a lot of it is environmental in terms of their exposure to being able to strike and the support they receive in order to develop that skill. All right, the last 3 object manipulation skills we'll talk about are punting, kicking, and stationary ball bouncing. Of course, stationary ball bouncing is a fundamental skill that's used in a variety of different sports, and we will typically often refer to that as dribbling. At an advanced level, that dribbling occurs when a person bounces or moves the ball using a hand to push the ball repeatedly downward, but it can't really be described as that dribbling action when an inexperienced performer is using 1 or 2 hands simply to strike the ball. It often looks more and resembles a slapping action than dribbling. Striking is one of the developmental stages of dribbling, but it is distinguished, of course, by how you strike the ball, and you start to absorb the speed and velocity of the ball, which turns it into a dribble. In this figure is an example of that striking progression, or the slapping. Here we've got less control over the object. It's very rigid, and it's not under control at all. The direction and the velocity in which the ball is moved results in an erratic angle coming back up to the dribbler or to the striker, which means they can't do it very often. Once they start to absorb the ball and have it moving under control, we start to see it evolving into a bit of a dribble, and we'll see that on the next slide. All right, good example here of the mature dribble, fully extending the arm, and when the hand-ball contact is made, it's softening, absorbing the ball as it comes up and pushing it back down. The arm retracts, the hand maintains contact with the ball for a prolonged period of time throughout the dribble, and that allows for the control that I talked about, which is different than the slapping we saw in the earlier stage. Kicking is another form of striking, except you use the feet, obviously, and in this particular case, we're going to talk about sort of the place kicking, where the ball is on the ground or on some kind of a tee, and we're learning, as this young boy is, to figure out how to make that ball move by striking it with the feet. In its most mature form, the advanced place kicker or kicker will approach the ball from a running start. The last step is taken prior to the ball foot contact, and it involves a bit of a leap step into the planting foot or support foot, and then simultaneously the kicking leg is prepared by flexing the knee and hyperextending the hip. This preparatory backswing will enable the leg to be able to thrust forward vigorously and then provide power to project the ball. And also important is in the third phase of this action is the what happens after you kick the ball, and the leg continues to travel upward and following through ideally towards the target, which will have a fairly important part of where the ball ends up going. The follow through should be vigorous enough to cause the support leg to leave the ground. They actually lift off with their planted foot. Simply put, a hop is performed on the support leg, and during this kicking sequence, the kicker's entire center of gravity is displaced. And to maintain the balance through an advanced mature kick, the advanced place kicker positions the trunk so it leans slightly backward, and the arms oppose the actions of the leg to help to keep the balance. So again, in the three phases we see here, the preparatory phase, the force production phase, and the follow-through phase are all what I've just described. We'll see some visuals of it here. Okay, let's dissect this stage one kicking. From a preparatory perspective, the kicker is pretty stationary and positioned really close to the ball. If the performer or kicker moves prior to kicking, the steps are short and concerned with spatial relationships rather than attaining any momentum for the kick. With respect to the force production, the thigh of the kicking leg moves forward with the knee flexed and is nearly parallel to the surface by the time the foot contacts the ball. Knee joint extension occurs after contact, resulting in a pushing rather than a striking action. On the follow-through here, the knee of the kicking leg continues to extend until it approaches about 180 degrees if the trunk is inclined forward following the contact with the ball. In that case, the performer will step forward to regain their balance. If the trunk is leaning backwards, though, the kicking leg will move backwards after the ball contact in order to achieve body balance. So again, we ideally want to see that more forward momentum, but in an inexperienced kicker, often they'll step back, like we see in this example here where the person's leaning slightly backwards. Kicker in stage two here is still pretty stationary, maybe some initial action involving hyperextension at the hips and flexion at the knees so that the thigh of the kicking leg is behind the mid-frontal plane. The arms sometimes move into a position of opposition in situations of extreme hyperextension at the hips. With respect to the force production, the kicking leg is moving forward with the knee joint in a flex position, and the knee joint extension begins just prior to foot contact with the ball. Arm-leg opposition occurs during the kick here in stage two. The follow-through, if you'll note here, where the knee extension continues after the ball leaves the foot, but the force of the kick is, again, usually not sufficient enough to move the body forward. Instead, the performer usually steps backwards or maybe sometimes sideways to recover their balance after the follow-through of the kick. In stage three, we start to see the kicker take one or maybe even more deliberate and intentional steps to approach the ball. The support leg is placed near the ball and slightly off to the side of it. The kicking foot stays, with respect to force production, stays near the surface as it approaches the ball, resulting in less flexion than in stage two. The trunk remains nearly upright, thereby preventing maximum force production. The knee begins to extend prior to contact, and the arm-leg opposition in this stage is evident. With respect to the follow-through, the force of the kick in this particular case may carry the performer past the point of contact if the approach was vigorous enough. Otherwise, the performer stays again at the point of contact. This is an example of a vigorous and intentional mature kicking style. We see that the approach involves one or more steps, with the final step being an airborne run or leap into a planting position with the opposite leg. This permits the hyperextension of the hip and the flexion of the knee as in stage two. With respect to force production, the shoulders are retracted and the trunk is inclined backwards as the supporting leg makes contact with the surface and the kicking leg begins to move forward. The movement of the thigh nearly stops as the knee joint begins to extend rapidly just prior to contact with the ball. Arm-leg opposition is present as in the previous two stages. And the follow-through in this case has such forward momentum that, again, that the performer either hops on the supporting leg or scissors the legs while airborne in order to land on the kicking foot. If the kicking foot is not vigorous, the performer may merely step in the direction of the kick, which again is sufficient. If they followed through towards their target, it means the momentum of the ball is being sent in the direction that they intended. Here we see a big gap between the first and second stages of development in boys and in girls, and a big gap in the boys between stages 3 and 4. What this tells you is that the boys get to stage 3 by less than 5 years old, and the girls after 6 years old. But it takes the boys quite a bit longer to develop the strength in order to be able to exhibit the mature level of kicking that we see in this picture. This slide is just a reminder for you to check out the videos that I've put in the folder so you can see real kids doing these various object control skills.
Kicking is a form of striking in which one uses a body part, the leg, to strike an object. Kicking in an immature fashion can be observed in children as young as 2 years of age. At that stage of development, the kick is barely recognizable as one of the fundamental motor patterns. As the kicker advances to a mature stage, preparation again becomes evident. The mature kicker, as viewed here, prepares the leg for kicking by a considerable flexion of the knee and the hip. This preparation enables a vigorous thrusting forward of the leg and subsequently a powerful projection of the ball. Also noticed in the mature kicking pattern is the arm action. The arms, as in running, oppose the action of the legs and are a necessary component if the individual's balance is to be maintained. Finally, the leg follows through like the arm would in the mature throwing pattern. So, movement of the leg continues after the ball has been kicked. The immature kicker lacks many of these characteristics. In fact, initially a child takes no approach, omits all preparatory movements, and merely pushes the ball away with the foot or the leg when standing next to the ball. No arm swing is observable, and the legs remain straight. The action of the arms and legs are thought to be impeded by the child's relatively poor balance. At an intermediate level of kicking development, pre-kick movements are noticeable. Although less flexion of the knee and hip can be observed here than in the mature pattern, some preparation is evidenced. The arms, necessary to counterbalance the kicking motion, are in an elevated position but do not seem to be working in opposition to the legs. Finally, a follow-through of the leg is evident after the kick, but less noticeable than we would expect in a mature level of kicking development. To summarize kicking, let's review the major characteristics of this fundamental motor pattern. In the immature kicker, we see no approach to the ball. There is no preparation of the leg. The arms are maintained in a high position, but for balance, no opposition of the leg movement is made with the arms. No follow-through is evidenced. In the mature kicker, we see that an approach to the ball is taken. The leg is prepared to kick by flexion of the knee and an extension of the hip. The arms oppose the leg action for counterbalancing. And finally, the leg follows through after the kick is made.
Unlike place kicking, which requires one to kick a stationary ball, punting involves striking an airborne ball with a foot. Obviously, the complexity of the punt greatly exceeds that of place kicking because there's the added difficulty of having to drop the ball proficiently towards the foot. Boy is doing a very good job of dropping the ball in an angle and in a position that he's going to be able to successfully punt that. In this particular case, football, but it could be a soccer ball if you're a goalie. It could be a rugby ball if you're a player, and moving the ball forward in a game situation. So punting is the last of the object control skills that we'll discuss in this OLM. In stage 1, we see that the punter is stationary as the hands and the foot prepare for the punting action. The ball is held with both hands at the waist height or maybe even higher. prior to placing it in its position for punting. The problem with this is that in some cases they actually toss the ball up, sending it off often in a direction that wasn't intended, and that means they have to scramble just to get to the ball to make contact with it at all. The ball may be manipulated in a variety of ways for punting. First of all, it could be that it's held in with both hands as the punting foot is lifted forward and upward with the hip and knee flexion, or the ball may be tossed up and forward into the air, and the performer must then move forward and get into position and move their whole body to get into position in order to be able to punt it. Or the performer, in some cases, may bounce the ball and attempt to punt it as it rebounds from the surface. Whatever the mode of placing the ball into a punting position, the primary characteristics of stage 1 are a stationary preparatory position and flexion at the hip and knee of the punting leg, placing these segments in front of the mid-frontal plane. In the second stage, the punter is still stationary during the preparatory phase, and the ball is held in both hands and may be dropped or tossed forward or upward in preparation for punting it with the foot. The non-support leg is flexed at the knee, and the thigh is perpendicular to the surface or behind the mid-frontal plane as the leg is placed into the punting position. As the punting leg moves forward, its momentum may carry the performer forward for a step, but generally the force is upward, causing the punter to step backwards after striking the ball. Here in the third stage, we see the punter moving forward deliberately for one or more steps in the preparatory phase. The ball is generally released in a forward and downward direction as it's intended to be, and the knee is flexed at 90 degrees or less, but the thigh is farther behind the mid-frontal plane than in stage 2 because of that stepping action. The follow-through of the striking leg will generally carry the punter ahead of the point where the ball was contacted. In this final slide of the Object Control Skills online learning modules, we see that the punter's approach is rapid, usually comprising of one or more steps and culminating in a leap just prior to contacting the ball. If the leap does not precede the punt, the forward momentum may be enhanced by taking a larger step. The ball is contacted at or below knee height as a result of the ball having been released in a forward and downward direction. The momentum of the swinging leg carries the punter off of the surface in an upward and forward direction after the punt.